Good morning, Yochanan.
Hi, Dan.
It's good to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you.
Yeah. So, I'd like to welcome our listeners to another episode of the HaTzur Institute for Biblical Research podcast.
Yeah, I'm excited about what we've got today.
We're starting a new series. It's on the Book of Deuteronomy. This was born out of our desire to go deeper into the Psalms, and we realized we need more preparation and more circumspect study. So we thought to go to Isaiah. And then we decided, before going into Isaiah, we'd best understand Deuteronomy, on which Isaiah bases so much of his oracles.
Well, many of the prophets as well, but yeah.
So here we are. We're going to give an introductory episode to the Book of Deuteronomy. We're going to touch on a few big points, and over the coming few weeks or few months, we're going to break it down more and more and more. And we hope this will be fruitful listening for all of you. So what do we have for us today, Yochanan?
Well, I think the first question is, like, what is this book about? And we want to look today just kind of at the structure of the book and see if we can get to what the heart of the message is. I mean, we'll talk more about that in further podcasts, but maybe it's good just to read the first 8 verses just to kind of place where we're at with the Book of Deuteronomy. This is the last of the books that are sometimes called in English the Pentateuch. The Penta is 5, like it's the 5 books of Moses.
Right.
So this is the last one. And chronologically also, it talks about the last stage of the Exodus, you could say, just before the people go into the land. And that's the setting. So the setting, and there's a couple of important things that come up in this, in the first 8 verses. It tells us about this. These are the words of Moses that he spoke to Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness. So they're across the Jordan. They're on the east side of the Jordan. And this was 11 days' journey from Horeb, but it wasn't 11 days, right, that it took them.
It took closer to 38 years.
Right. So this is the end of the 40 years since they've left Egypt. One generation has passed away, the generation that didn't believe.
Everyone who was 20 years and older
Right.
at the time of the rejection, after the episode of the spies who returned with a bad report of the land.
Right. And it goes on to say that this is, in verse 3, this is the 40th year, the first day of the 11th month. Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that the Lord had commanded him to give to them, after he had defeated Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and Edrei, across the Jordan in the land of Moses undertook, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this law, saying.
Mm-hmm. So, basically, this is a book that is going to expound on the law.
It kind of leaves us with this question, well, what does that exactly mean?
Well, the first thought that comes to mind is maybe all those tricky and difficult laws and statutes and commandments that came in the previous books, like Exodus and God knows Leviticus and Numbers. Is he going to explain them here?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, firstly, it's really important that he says that he's going to explain this law, this law. So it's something that they already have. Mm-hmm. The word in Hebrew, be'er, can have different connotations, right?
We usually think of it as expound, explain, elucidate.
Right. Exactly.
So
yeah.
But in this case, what's actually going to happen? He doesn't actually explain laws better in this book. I mean, some of them get a few different words, maybe some more light, but otherwise there's a big repetition of many of the previous laws.
Right.
So what is he actually expounding on?
Well, this is something that to me is really exciting, and I would encourage our listeners to look at this book as a book. Mm-hmm. You know, like sometimes...
You mean as a narrative?
Yeah, as a narrative, but and as a book has a purpose. But also, actually, what we will see is that this book isn't a standalone book. It actually has a connection. We'll see that, especially at the end of Deuteronomy, with the beginning of Genesis, actually. So when we say the book, we might be talking about the book of Deuteronomy, but actually there's signs within the book of Deuteronomy that we're supposed to read it as a book which is part of the wider book, which includes everything from Genesis.
So what we in Israel, we call the Torah, is not really 5 books of Moses, but rather it's a book. It's one big tome with 5 divisions that are really interconnected.
They're very interconnected, and I think we have the key, to be honest, and this is exciting, we have the key to understand the message of the whole actually at the end. And it's the key to understand both the book of Deuteronomy as a book, but also to understand the wider book of the Pentateuch, the Torah, when we come to the end, because of the connections back to the beginning of Genesis, which is very interesting.
Well, we might be jumping ahead of ourselves. We're not going to be speaking of the end of Deuteronomy. We're only just at the beginning. Can I bring up something I've noticed often in my reading and discussing things with you even before this recording? I feel like I understand things, or at least see things a little better. I've often noticed when I read in the Torah, in the books of Moses, I find that most of it is sort of flowing narrative. He said, and then he answered, and that guy said, and they spoke, and they did, and this is what happened. But when you get to Deuteronomy, it doesn't feel as direct. It feels like there's one more step between me, the reader, and what happened in the past. And it comes in the form of the narrator.
Right.
The narrator seems much more present in the book of Deuteronomy. And instead of having live dialogue, so to speak, between Moses and Israel, or Moses and God, we get the narrator telling us what Moses said at that time, at that place, in the wilderness, across in the land of Moab, and so on and so forth. All this.
It's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, the narrator might actually be Moses himself, but like in the first verse, it says, "These are the words which Moses spoke."
Right.
And then at the end of verse 5, you get where it says, Moses undertook to expound this law, saying.
Yes.
And then from verse 6, you have what he says right up until the end of of chapter 4.
But this is also what I'm referring to.
Right.
Like the narrator is quoting to us what Moses said back then.
Right.
And then something else I notice is that God isn't so very present in the book in a direct way. He's not a live character. He's a character of the past. These are the things that God said, or sometimes even in a more indirect, 2 steps ahead, removed from us, we have the narrator telling us what Moses said, and then as he quotes Moses, Moses was telling the people what God had said,
right. It's
either
very
at Mount Sinai or...
It's very interesting if you go through the book of Deuteronomy to actually mark out where the narrator is speaking, because actually the narrator doesn't say much, but it comes in and then he's got these long quotes of Moses, and within those quotes of Moses tells us what God said at Sinai, what God said to him here, what God said to the people through him. And we even actually have a couple of places where there's a quote within the quote, within the quote, like it's 4 levels.
Four levels.
It's very interesting, very interesting. But let's look at just at the overall structure for a moment.
Excellent.
Because I think this is really important. So we start by going back in time. And the first more or less 13 chapters, and again, this is a wide way of looking at it, are going, it's like if you have a torch that's going, or like if we were filming it, the camera goes back to the past and then comes back to the present, goes back to the past and then comes back to the present. And there's a couple of times where we get, this is looking back and saying, this happened then, and then it comes to the present and says, and now.
So what you're saying is, in other words, if I'm following what you're saying, the book of Deuteronomy is so focused about what happened, what Moses told this second generation of Israelites just before crossing the Jordan into Israel. And in his telling, he's often bringing up the things that happened prior to this moment.
Right. Well, this is the first 13 chapters.
And what you get often in his telling of their history in the wilderness is, for English readers, it's often translated at that time. And at that time, the Lord said, and at that time, the Lord did, and at that time, we crossed here, and at that time, we traveled there, and so on and so forth.
Right.
But then it's contrasted with...
And then it comes back to and now. And the and now is talking to the people who are now in Moab, which is the other side of the Jordan River, just before they're crossing into Israel, into the land of Israel. And one example is chapter 4, verse 1. And now, Israel, hear the laws and the judgments. So he's saying, okay, you're about to go into the land. So remember what God did for you in the past. Mm-hmm. And on the basis of what God has done for you in the past, this is how you should behave. And that is kind of this theme. I mean, you see it again, for instance, in chapter 10, where in the beginning of chapter 10, he goes back to say, in that time, the Lord said to me. And then it talks about how God had told him to make two more
tablets.
Two more stone tablets, right? Which Moses had broken because he'd come down, and we've already had that story now. But now he's saying, at that time, God told me to do this, and then he goes on, and then he comes back in verse 12 of chapter 10 to say, and now, Israel, in the light of God's mercy and what he did, and he let us have the two tablets again, which were the covenant stipulations, and now, Israel, and we'll come back to an important theme here, but here we see again this, because of the past in the present. Mm-hmm. So again, just looking at it largely, this we get through to chapter 13, and at the end of chapter 13, then we get chapter 14, 2:26.
How about we take a step back for a moment? Let's try and break down just the most general structure of this book. Because in discussing some things before with you, I remember we spoke of chapters 1 through 4 make one segment. And then chapters 5 through, was it 11? Walk us through this.
Well, I'm saying again, like up until chapter 13, mm-hmm. where there's subsections in that. And it's looking back to the past and then coming back to the present. For instance, chapter 1 to 4. And then from chapter 5, we have Hear, O Israel. Mm-hmm. And there we have this amazing command.
So if I recall, chapters 1 through 4 are basically Moses recalling and recounting everything that happened up until now since they left Mount Sinai. He talks about, look, you people were too much for me to judge on my own, so I divided the people into judges, etc. And then we came up to this land, and we thought, you guys thought that we should send some spies, and I thought it was a good idea. And he's basically retelling the whole journey. Much of the book of Numbers that just preceded, some of what happened in Exodus. And when he comes to the conclusion of what happened, bringing them up to speed on how they got to where they're standing now, he says, and now, O Israel, these are the laws and the statutes that the Lord has commanded you. Right. And from chapter 5 until...
But this kind of framework plays out right up until chapter 13. I mean, again, he's going back again to different things that happened after the events that you've mentioned in the first 3 chapters. Chapter 4 is very important because he talks about the covenant. He talks about now what we're doing now. Mm-hmm. So he goes between what God has done for us in the past to what we're doing now in the present, and the present being, here we are at Horeb, God is renewing the covenant with us because all of our fathers who didn't trust God have passed away. So now we're renewing the covenant in order to go into the land. Then and all of this is, so it goes back and forth with a special emphasis on remembering. I mean, it's not just saying, this is what happened. It's not just like a recollection of the history. It's saying, remember it, with a very strong emphasis on don't forget. And chapter 8, for instance, this is an amazing chapter where he says, in the future also don't forget. This will be something very important for you. Don't forget what God did for you.
So the past deeds of God make the basis for the present and future conduct of Israel.
Exactly. And for this call, look how good he's been to you.
And for the readers as well, I suppose.
Exactly.
You could take it a step further and say the future readers, the future generations of Israel are to find a basis for their proper conduct based on what God has done for their forefathers.
Right. And the whole reason for this is also given in chapter 7, because verse 6, because you are a holy people. God has separated you from other people. He's given you a special status. And that then becomes, in chapter 14, the beginning of what is another main section of the book, which is 14 to 26.
So what happens in 14 to 26?
14 to 26 is what you mentioned earlier, like what we would expect. Okay, so he's explaining the Torah. So here we have again, like almost like a list of laws.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them have appeared in Exodus and other places, but now sometimes they're just repeated. Sometimes they're repeated in a slightly different way. But the interesting thing is that there's bookends for that section, where the beginning and the end, the people are told that they are the sons of God, in chapter 14, verse 1, for instance.
Interesting.
And at the end of chapters 26, they're again told that they are, and the same words appear in both places, that you are a holy people.
This is at the end of 26?
At the end of 26. Well, in chapter 14, the beginning, it says, you are the sons of the Lord your God,
mm-hmm.
and therefore you shall do this. Verse 2, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the people on the face of the earth. And that appears at the end of chapter 26 as well. And between those declarations of this people being a holy people, there are all of these explanations of what you should do, how you should do, including even like how you should treat the stranger, how you should fight a war, how many things like this. So what it's looking like is that now the people are being told how they should look like as God's holy chosen people when they come into the land that he's promised them.
Mm-hmm.
This is what they should look like.
So the book so far, let's say from 1 until 26, as much as we've covered in broad strokes, is a strong exhortation of Moses to the second generation to behave appropriately to the covenant that they've made or that they're making with God. God has done things in their past, i.e., he's brought them out of Egypt, out of bondage, into freedom, etc., etc., etc. He has provided for them. He has promised a land to their fathers that he is now preparing for them to inherit. And therefore, because God has done all those things, then they should behave a certain way. It's also quite unique in Deuteronomy that he calls them sons of God.
Right.
It doesn't appear before in Exodus.
Well, that's something very important, because the whole idea of relationship is central. The idea of relationship,
mm-hmm.
And that because of that, for instance, you see the combination of not just fearing God with the meaning of knowing who he truly is, but also loving him. I mean, that's in chapter 6, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God. So that relationship is also in the context of a covenant. And that covenant, after this section of 14 to 26, where this is kind of like an explanation of how you should look like as my sons, then you get the stipulations of, well, you have a choice. I'm calling you to walk in my way, and there will be blessings if you do,
so now
and curses if you don't.
So you've just taken us past chapter 26. What is the next section after chapter 26 then?
Well, chapter 27, really to 29, is what some people would call like the results of whether you listen to God or not.
The consequences.
The consequences.
So you have two choices, and these are the consequences of either choice.
Yeah.
If you walk with God, blessing. If you don't walk with
And-
God, chastisement that eventually might end in
Well, the culmination of the chastisement is, of course,
exile.
exile.
From the land that he has promised
Right.
the forefathers.
And when you get to chapter 30, we see again a call that's really framed in terms of choose this day, because now the people are really being brought into a renewal of the covenant, and they're being told, see, I've given to you this day life and good, or death and evil. But this is really important when we mention that verse. This is chapter 31.
Before we touch on that verse, is there a final section?
Yes, but we need, let's, this is important. Chapter 30, verse 15, he says, behold, I've given before you this day life and good and death and evil. But that actually is a repetition of something that appeared in chapter 1, which is really important because it kind of then gives us bookends for this part of the book. So we've talked about different sections like chapter 1 to 4, chapter 5 onwards, up until 13, and then 14 to 26, where there's the laws and how you should look as a holy people, and then 27, 29, like this is the blessings if you walk with me, and these are the curses that you're not. And then chapter 30 says, okay, so now do this. But in chapter 1, we were told that God says in chapter 1, verse 8,
see, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to your fathers.
Right. So,
and in chapter 30, you were looking at verse 15. It says again, see, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil.
So here's a really important thing that, again, this is the structure of the book, because we start out by God saying, see, I have set before you the land. So he's saying the land is set before you. Actually, in chapter 11, there's another verse which says, see, today I've put before you curse and blessing, which is, again, almost a repetition. But then in chapter 30, verse 15, we get exactly this, see, I have set before you. The difference being in chapter 1, it's in the plural. I have set before you, in the plural, you all. And here it's you as a collective in chapter 30. But here's the interesting thing. Because when we get to chapter 30 and setting before you life and death, good and evil, I mean, what does that remind us of?
Life and death, good and evil. Well, it reminds me of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's
exactly. So here's an amazing thing, that the land, the people are now being brought into the land, like Adam was put into the garden. And just as Adam was given the one choice, right? Not to eat from the tree of the fruit of good and evil. And when he did take that fruit, he found out there was another tree, the tree of life.
Well, he was forbidden the access to the tree of life after that.
Right. But those two trees were there.
Right.
But now we find that now the people are being put into the land like Adam was put into the Garden of Eden. And now they're also given this choice. See, I've set before you today, as they go into the land. It's almost like Israel is being presented now in the book, in the structure as a whole, up until chapter 30, as a microcosm of mankind, of man.
I mean, this is a topic worth more than one episode, certainly. The similarities and differences between Adam and Eve and, say, Israel later. But you're saying Israel as a people being presented as a microcosm or as a bigger reflection of what Adam achieved and failed to do in the garden. So, I mean, if I take it a step, just to elucidate a little bit more, in the garden, Adam was given a commandment a commandment that's very similar in its language to any of the 10 commandments, for instance. Thou shalt not, if I use the KJV, thou shalt not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. So one commandment he's given, and that commandment his wife and he break, and basically they choose death because he knew what the consequences would be, despite whatever the serpent would have said. Thou shalt not die. And now we have Israel coming out of Egypt, being brought out of bondage, brought to the very edge of the promised land. And Moses, after exhorting them for 30 chapters to do good and to follow God and to love him and to fear him, he presents them with very similar words.
Exactly.
See, I set before you good and life, death and evil.
And this is the interesting thing. If this is where the book ended, because in a sense, that's almost a natural end to the book.
Right. But basically, people, guys, just do this. If you do this right, you'll succeed in everything.
You'll be blessed.
Yes.
Right.
So I got to leave here. I'm not allowed to go into the land, but you people just keep this Torah really well and everything will turn out fine.
Right. So if that's where we ended the book, we would really have religion as we know it today even. But here's the thing. There's a twist at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, where in the overall structure, that twist then gives a huge meaning to the book as a whole. Mm. And that twist comes in chapter 31, where we're told from verse 14 that God speaks to Moses and tells him that his time has come, but he also tells him something else. He says, verse 16, behold, you're about to lie down with your fathers, and this people will arise and play the harlot. So basically, he's saying, this is a twist at the end that turns the whole thing into a tragedy. It's like saying, okay, 30 chapters, this is the way you should walk in like what you've said. But then God says, but I know that you're not going to do it.
Yeah, you're going to die, and they're not going to do it.
And they're not going to do it. And he even tells Moses in verse 21 why they're not going to do it. In verse 21, he says, and it shall come about when many evils and troubles have come upon them, that this song, it's a song which comes in the next chapter, which is very significant, that this song will testify before them or against them as a witness, for it shall not be forgotten from the lips of their descendants. For I know their intent, which they're developing today.
New King James reads inclination of their behavior today.
So here's the interesting thing. In Hebrew, that word is yetzel, which is translated here. This is the New American
intent or inclination.
Intent or inclination. The only other place that word appears
in the
Torah is in Genesis, where God says about the people before the flood that he sees that every intent, every inclination,
their inclination is to do
of
evil,
their heart is to do evil
all day long.
So here we have another piece of evidence that the text itself is connecting us to the beginning of Genesis, and just as what we saw about having the choice between life and death, good and evil, took us back to the Garden of Eden. This takes us back to the problem of mankind. The heart of the people of Israel is the same as the heart of mankind. And so again, they're being presented, as the book is presenting us, the people of Israel as a kind of microcosm.
So in a way, God made man in the garden, and man ate of the fruit. Later, things got so bad with the sons of God, etc., etc. Everyone was so wicked and violent that their inclination is to wickedness all day long. This is Genesis 6. And God wipes the whole earth away with water, except for one family. In chapter 8, if I recall, the same word shows up again. And even after the flood, when one family remains, still the same inclination is present.
Right.
In other words, whatever the problem is with humans, it's not with certain humans, it's with humanity as a whole.
And Israel is an example that God is working with in order to show us both the problem of mankind it's the problem of Israel. And it's the same problem. It's the inclination
So
of our
even
heart.
if you give them a perfect law, even if you bring them out with great wonders and miracles and a strong arm, it doesn't change the very essence or nature of the people. And this is what God reveals at the end of the book.
Exactly. And here this amazing statement where verse 26 in chapter 31, where Moses tells the Levites, take this book of the law and place it beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it may remain there as a witness against you. In other words, already we're being told in the book of Deuteronomy that what we've thought for 30 chapters is our directive, what we should do, how a book of laws of how we should behave, now is actually a book which is a witness against us, which is a witness that shows our sin. The amazing thing is, if that's one twist at the end of the book, the next twist is at the end of the song in chapter 32, which goes through the future story of Israel, and ends up by saying that the Lord will atone for his land, his people. And that there is God's answer, which really is an amazing thing, because in Deuteronomy 32, verse 43, after talking about the people's sin and how they sin, and we will talk about that in another podcast possibly, but comes this amazing statement at the end of seeing, well, this tragedy. So what are we supposed to do? It's God's solution. And God's solution in Deuteronomy 32, verse 43 is he will atone his land, his people.
Yeah, God will provide atonement for his land and his people. It's not something that the people might outdo themselves, that one day a generation will arise that actually keeps the commandments perfectly by having bigger hats or bigger kippas or better teaching and education. It is something that God will have to provide himself.
Right. And so that actually turns this book in an amazing way into the gospel.
I mean, it certainly points to something beyond us and our religions, our man-made laws and rules. Even when we take it from God, we still try to abide them by our own efforts. And the end of Deuteronomy, you could say, what you're saying is it throws us back to the promise to the woman. A seed will come, and he will take care of this problem. And then we see the same thing occur in so many of the other prophets. When we see the failure of Israel sort of live, quote unquote, everything that Moses foretold happens in the centuries to come, and those prophets cover those eras, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and so forth. And they speak of the failure now. They exhort the people to do better and repent, and yet they also, in resignation, say, a day will come. Days are coming, and God will provide the answer.
Right. And the interesting thing is, in Deuteronomy, the subsequent chapter after that solution in chapter 32 is blessing, because chapter 33 is the blessing of Moses.
Yeah.
This is the blessing, which again takes us back to the beginning of Deuteronomy and the blessing. So the overall structure of both Deuteronomy and its role within the structure of the 5 books of Moses is quite amazing.
This was fascinating, Yochanan. I'm really glad we opened up this intro to Deuteronomy. I'm excited about our studies deeper into the book. I often feel like this book is really a hinge between the beginning and everything that comes afterwards. I look forward to our next episodes.
So do I.
Tune in again for our next episode, and we'll start delving into these bigger chunks of Deuteronomy.
Great.
Until then, peace be with you.